get a sense of the lay of the land. You can see we have a map over there, and we keep hearing about, after October 7th, Israel is now in a multi-front war, a 7-front war, a 9-front war, an 8-front war. And before we have our more in-depth conversation, I think it would be really useful to get a sense of what these fronts are and where Israel is on this map, and in the context of the whole geographic setting, just to give us a lay of the land. So, David, could you please walk us through this?
Yeah, I'll start, if it's okay with everybody, is sort of a very short briefing where all these fronts are and what all these fronts are. Not to go into too much depth, I've spoken to quite a number of you, and you probably all know almost as much or more than I do on many of these. So I'll be rather brief. If anybody wants more depth, we can have questions, or we can, but let me start with where we are. When they say 8 fronts, 9 fronts, there's obviously Gaza, which started on October 7th. A few hours later, early October 8th, you had Lebanon with Hezbollah. You started having unrest fairly quickly after that in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. So the third front was Judea and Samaria, which actually recently has been one of the most active fronts in the war. You had missiles shot across the border in Syria, which is the fourth front. Drones and missiles being shot from Iraq onto Israel from the Shahab, that's the fifth front. Around October 28th, I believe it was, the Yemenis, the Houthis in Yemen, a rebel group in Yemen, which controls about half the country, started shooting missiles at ships and at Israel to try to close the straits of the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and the Suez Canal. So that's the sixth front. Then you had in April the first burp in this, but then the much more serious exchange on the, where is it, the seventh front, which is Iran itself, which is significant. It was the first direct Israeli-Iranian confrontation. So where do 8 and 9 come from? 8 is fortunately the front that has only slightly happened, which is the internal Arabs in Israel. We had some scary moments a few months ago where there was almost a bomb attack, wave of bomb attacks, and there's a series of smaller attacks, stabbings, and so forth. It's a bubbling thing. It's out there, and I raise it as a front because only 4 years ago, in the last missile war, this was a big front. You had literally pogroms in Israeli cities, in Lod, Ramle, Yaffo, Akko, Haifa, of Arabs against Jews. And this is inside what's called 48 Israel. So what's the ninth front? The ninth front is the front that hooks up with what we're dealing with globally, which is the internal fissure in Israeli society, which cannot be understood in isolation of Israel. There are uniquely Israeli attributes to this internal fissure, but it is a reflection of a much larger movement in the entire West, where you have essentially a progressive left challenging the very foundations of the democratic state and the authority, the democratically elected authority of a government when they don't agree that that's the one that was elected. There are reasons why it was so intense in Israel that are unique. It isn't entirely a black and white issue on the two sides, but by and large, one has to understand that front as part of the larger Western fissure that we're seeing. And why is this raised in the context of this war? Because Hamas and Iran know it, and they use it effectively as part of their strategy to shut Israel down. And its effect and its ability to be effective in Gaza and against Iran. And it hooks up with here because we have these fissures in the West as well, and they tap into that. So these fronts fuse. So where do we stand on all this? Basically, we saw with Operation Grim Beeper, as it's begun to be called, Hezbollah front essentially has been shut down, although I think you're going to see it in the news soon again. It's unfortunately coming back a little bit. The elections in Lebanon turned up a Hezbollah victory. Surprise, they still have guns. Syria, I'm not encouraged by this new government. I think it's the best image you can buy, in a very slick image, but I think whether one believes this new government under Giuliani or not, I think it's essentially still a dangerous government that is part of a larger strategic movement with Qatar and Turkey. Iran obviously is very hot and heavy. Iraq may be shut down to some extent. Yemen is not shut down, obviously. Every night, my son is studying in Haifa. Every night he has to get up, or his friends have to get up in Tel Aviv. The missiles still are flying. As I said, Judea and Samaria is actually very active right now. Qalqilia, Tulkarm, heavy fighting going on as we speak. And Gaza, we're at the edge of really the moment of truth. I don't think Israel can sit on this much more than a few more days. The reserves are getting edgy. It's the last call-up that people seem to want to tolerate. Too many Israelis have been mobilized for hundreds of days at a time. They just need it wrapped up, and unfortunately, it's the balance between the lives of the hostages and winning the war. And the cost, it's the old, for those who study history, it's the Coventry decision. You know, how much do you take the individual lives of certain citizens and you put them up against the national interest? And the awful choice that is, and that's exactly what Hamas wanted. So we have, I think we're reaching a moment of truth in both Iran and in Gaza, and we can get into it as we go along about the United States, where it is and so forth, but I think we're talking days on Gaza and days and weeks with Iran.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's fabulous summation of, we've heard the word quagmire so often, but it really seems like a quagmire. Daniel, what are anything to add to that? One of the things that hasn't come up is thus far is Qatar in your rundown of this. Where is Qatar in this? Daniel or Frank?
Daniel's just written on it.
I've been writing about Qatar for quite some time, and this is part of the whole larger issue of this idea that there are moderate and extremist Islamic terrorists. The reality, of course, is that there's no such thing as moderates or extremists. Erdogan, who oversaw the seizure, the capture of Syria, said it best that there's no moderate Islam, there's just Islam. So when it comes to Qatar, there's no such thing as a moderate Islamic state, and Qatar is not a moderate Islamic state. It is an Islamic terrorist state, one that does not personally fire rockets or send off bombs, rather one that sponsors the terrorists who do it. And that's very similar to the way the Muslim Brotherhood operates inside the United States as well. They play cover for the terrorists, they assist the terrorists, but they themselves pretend that they are moderate. So this is a game that is routinely played throughout the Muslim world. It's played within Western countries where Islamist organizations operate, and it's played on a global level. And Qatar is one of the major sponsors of all of this. The so-called moderate organizations in the United States that are really the Muslim Brotherhood and the terrorist groups. Qatar got us into the terrible deal with the Taliban that allowed them to take over Afghanistan and cost the lives of 13 American soldiers and left American hostages behind. They're now been the primary mover, not just behind Hamas, but behind getting the United States into accepting this arrangement in which we get an al-Qaeda state in Syria, in which we have another new Middle East. If you remember Obama's Arab Spring, we get a second Arab Spring, an Islamist Spring, one in which Islamists take power and one in which we sign off on it, not just in Gaza, not just in Israel, but across the region.
And they are one of the major funders of our universities.
Of course they are.
Which is, in large part, why we saw what we saw, I guess, figuratively, if not literally, on October 8th in the United States, right? The campus, all the campus rioting, was that To what extent was that a product of Qatari investment in exactly such hatred?
People who look at the campus craziness, they wonder what possible connection could there be between proponents of, Sharia law, Islamic repression, people who throw, gay people off roofs, and these seemingly very liberal, very woke students. And who's paying for all this? Well, the answer really is that, these days it's Qatar. Before there was Saudi Arabia and various other oil-rich states. They used their money to implement the Red-Green Alliance. And they did that by putting a lot of money into universities. Universities were ground zero. Actually, ground zero was D.C. They put a lot of money into D.C. Then they started putting money into universities, particularly ones that have students who go on to become foreign policy people. Then, of course, they began spreading their net even wider. They built up a media operation, stuff we can get into later. But it entirely makes sense if you understand that Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the others own Middle Eastern faculties across major universities. They own foreign policy faculties there. And from there, it becomes very easy for them to expand their purview, to build up operations like Students for Justice in Palestine on every campus, Muslim Students Association, which is run by the Muslim Brotherhood. And from there, they can begin taking over America through their campuses. The left did it. Now the Islamists are doing it.
I'd add something about Qatar, unless, Frank, you want to go? Go ahead. So you had the president go to the Middle East, and he visited the three big players, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE. And you really have to divide between Qatar on one side and Saudi Arabia and UAE on the other. I have a lot of reservations, and I'm not as big a fan of this whole attempt to really woo the Saudis at great cost. But that said, I think the concept that the president had was to essentially make an American moment that pulls these three away from the Chinese orbit. And we can get to that, what this Chinese orbit is, because I think it's a much larger problem than what people are thinking. And he went to the three, to each of the three. My problem with that is, when you go to the Saudis and the UAE, what they were doing was they were bidding to become our guy in the Middle East. And the reason for it is they're scared, and they want the American tent, and they want to be in the American tent. Qatar has a different agenda. It also wants to be our guy in the Middle East. And this hooks up with what Daniel's saying. They want to be our guy in the Middle East so they can be in the tent, so they can burn the tent down. They don't believe in the West. They want to destroy the West. But they're very manipulative and very clever about it. So the whole point for them, and you see it replicated on their behavior when President Trump was there, their behavior in funding campuses, it's always, we're just trying to help. We're just trying to be your friend. We're just trying to be the intermediary. We're just trying to fund American education. We're trying to do this. But behind it is the attempt to burn down the West. And in that, they are one of the most important allies to either the jihadi camp, which they're really the leader of, and the Chinese on the other side. And I think if you look at the Indo-Pakistani conflict, you really see the divide suddenly clarified. When on the first days of the war, you had Israel within hours siding with India, UAE more or less siding with India, but China, Iran, Qatar, and Turkey, especially Turkey, sided with Pakistan. And that's the Belt and Road, that's the Chinese orbit. So when you look at Qatar, it's an inside attempt to burn down the house or the tent. And that is the manipulative side that then hooks up to this ninth front in Israel and internationally that I mentioned. So.
Well, I wanted these guys to go first because I've learned almost everything I know about this subject from these guys. And so I'm just going to be sort of an amen chorus here. The other thing I just want to say at the outset, too, is Karen was, as always, extremely generous about her reliance on the rest of us. She is, as you know, a national treasure. And right here in Los Angeles. So it's nice to be able to hold her coat, her white coat, by the way. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of thoughts that these guys have raised. First of all, Karen has helpfully provided this map, and I think you might be able to see a little bit of a red thing here. That would be Israel. Everybody else on that map, just about, have something in common, in addition to, obviously, not being Israel. They are all part of what I think of as a Sharia supremacist enterprise. And as Erdogan put it, David quoted him, there is no moderate Islam, there is Islam. Mm-hmm. There's no moderate Sharia, that's for sure. And Sharia has as its most important point, there's some religious aspects to it, of course, you know, what you eat and what you don't eat and when you don't eat it and so on. How many times you pray, in which direction you pray. But the fundamental character of Sharia, it is a call to jihad. Holy war, violent, terrifying, holy war wherever possible. For what purpose? For the purposes of having the entire map be Sharia supremacist. And one of the things that I think is almost entirely lacking, even now, decades after 9/11, to just pick one particular travesty, is that most of us are unaware of what Sharia is, let alone what it means in practice, particularly for, as Daniel was just saying, the Judeo-Christian civilized world. It's, you know, Donald Trump has pronounced that one of the things that he envisions being the characteristic of his administration, and I resonated too, personally, because that's what I try to bring to this subject, is common sense. Well, you can't have a commonsensical approach if you lack an understanding of the fundamentals. When you have them, what David has just very helpfully laid out in terms of what is going on here, and Daniel has pointed out it's being made possible by a nation that the President of the United States was just embracing. I mean, literally, in the case of its emir, but metaphysically in terms of its money, its jet, and its role in the Middle East. Nothing could be more dangerous, in my personal commonsensical judgment, than giving a pass to the nation that not only epitomizes the jihadist sentiments called for by jihad, by Sharia, but is the great enabler of it worldwide. So we're going to have a conversation that I think is going to go in a lot of different directions. We're going to hopefully develop a lot of different thoughts and hopefully empower you not only to have a better understanding of what on earth is going on here, but why, with the very keen hope that you will be then able and prepared to help bring other people to a similar awareness that this is fundamentally, I believe, a spiritual war. Mm-hmm. One that truly is between evil incarnate and, certainly relatively speaking, and I would say actually in absolute terms as well, good. Yes. And if we don't understand the distinctions, if we don't understand the teams, if we don't understand what is impelling particularly the evil, it will become infinitely more difficult to devise and execute policies that assure the victory of the good.
Yeah. Over the years, last year especially, when we were talking about China and the new Cold War and now with this situation, one of the things that kept coming to my mind was, as Frank just pointed out, the extraordinary ignorance of people about this topic, and many of you have spoken to me about this. But I'm also reminded of a quote from Ronald Reagan. I'm just going to paraphrase it. The problem isn't so much that people are ignorant, it's that so much of what they know isn't so. And this misinformation, disinformation, concealment of true information this is really what we're seeing are the consequences of this. And in addition, as Frank just said, it is spiritual, it is good versus evil, and it's very rare to find people at this juncture who will talk in those terms. Ronald Reagan did. He called the enemy, the Soviet Union, the evil empire. And it's very hard to find people who will speak out in that way. Do you have a sense that this is good versus evil?
Yes, I mean, Frank, you've referred to it a few times as a trifecta of totalitarianism. And it is. I mean, let me define it around the good. So you go to the Bible, and in the Bible, you see four episodes really that are 3 points. Well, first was the near sacrifice of Isaac, which established the fact that human life is given and taken by God. It is not for even a father to dispense with. So it marked off the sanctity of the individual life, which is the foundation of we are endowed by our Creator by certain inalienable rights, which include life, liberty, and the pursuit of life. That's number one. The second one is the Tower of Babel versus Joshua's altar. The Tower of Babel was built with bricks. It was built with bricks that are all uniform and look alike, which is an allegory for a totalitarian structure, as opposed to Joshua's altar, which was to be built with unhewn stones, where each stone reflected the uniqueness of its creation. So the Jewish people certainly knew how to hew stones and make a very impressive altar, but it was made to be made with unhewn stones for that reason. And then the last one was something that we just went through here. Not once, but twice in the Sinai desert, while they were wandering, the Jewish people were wandering, there was a census. Why a census? God commanded a census, as if God can't count, or God doesn't know. No, the census is there to remind the Jewish people in the desert that they're a collection of individuals. Whereas at that time you had nations. So what you see is over and over and over again, the foundation of Judeo-Christian society is the focus on the individual and freedom. The focus in Islam and Sharia is on the totality, on the community, on the erasure of the individual on behalf of the community. And that's what brings it in line with the Chinese Communist Party and others. So the trifecta of totalitarianism versus the foundations of Western civilization, the whole Plato to NATO, but really starting at Mount Sinai or even earlier in Mount Moriah, that's really the fundamental divide that we see here. And that's what was invaded on October 7th, across that line. That was the line that was crossed, not just the line between Gaza and Israel, but you saw the line between respect for life and relish of death, the line between individual and the erasure of individuals and the dehumanization and so forth. So I think Frank can't put it better than that.
Well, just to clarify what I'm talking about, you defined well the good. I see three forces at work here. Most obviously, what we just talked about, the Sharia supremacists. And by that I mean, of course, all of them, the Sunnis and the Shiite. And let me just hasten to add, there are Muslims, you probably know some, who want no part of Sharia. They don't want to live under it. They certainly don't want to impose it on other people. And the authorities of Islam, and the key word there is the authorities of Islam, have a term for those people. They call them apostates. And under Sharia, any Muslim can execute the penalty for that crime, which is capital punishment. Consequently, even, I suspect, most of the Muslims you may know personally are not going to talk about the fact that they don't support Sharia. They know that it is baked into the Quran and the Hadiths from whence Sharia is drawn, the other sacred texts. They know it is dangerous to deviate from that direction. But let me just say, the thing that makes this moment so fraught is that in addition to the Sharia supremacist totalitarian threat, we also face, as I think David has pointed out, the communist movement, now effectively controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And the third element of the trifecta is what have come to be called the globalists. Now, one could argue that all three of these are globalists. They all have the same objective in mind: world domination. So to call people globalists and mean by that the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, various corporate entities that are party to all of that, Bill Gates comes to mind, is to miss the fact that these other outfits similarly think that there is a need for world government. And the problem for them is that they each have their own idea of who the world government will be made up of, who will run things. Well, they're going to sort that out, ladies and gentlemen, after the immediate objective that they share is accomplished, and that is getting us out of the way. And Israel is a speed bump en route to getting to us. So the challenge we face here, as we think through both the challenges that we're discussing and the options for doing something about it, is that we have to be mindful that, unfortunately, it's not just the most obvious perpetrators of the horrors that David and Daniel have talked about. That 8, 9, pick your number, front war, and the funding of it, the enabling of it. It's also that we've got now formidable allies who are willing to help people. I mean, think about this. The Chinese Communist Party are engaged in genocide against Uyghur Muslims. They've got millions of them in concentration camps where they're killing them, they're torturing them, they're harvesting their organs, and you'd never know it from the lash-up between the Turks and the Qataris, and for that matter, the Saudis, with the Chinese communists. And all of them are thick as thieves with the UN. All of them are hoping to run it, mind you, but they're all the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the largest bloc of Muslim organizations, of any group of nations in the UN, is that Sharia supremacist group. So as we go through this, please just keep this in mind. There are these factors that are making our challenges greater and making the need for understanding of them and your help in coming to grips with them all the greater.
And one of the things that was pointed out before is that every single one of those fronts, every one of those enemies combating against Israel also is an enemy of ours, because it's not just Israel, it's not just that map, it's quite literally Western civilization, because it is Western civilization that's in their way. We are the big Satan, we are the big impediment to their conquest. Israel is really the most forward front of this. So when people say, why should we help Israel, we should be much more contained, we not
America
worry about
first.
America first, and in fact, America only is something that comes up increasingly these days. Why Israel? Why not? Now we're going to help everybody in the whole world. This is not who we're supposed to be. Why is Israel such a special case on the entire globe?
So there's one thing I like to say, it's not about Israel, it's about Islam. That's really the thing to remember. We could be in their place, but so can any other country. One of the most revealing things was what happened with India. When there was a terrorist attack in India, India began campaigning against Pakistan, and suddenly we had the same exact narratives used against Israel being deployed against India. India is a made-up country. It didn't exist until 1948. Whoever heard of India before that? The point being that all the narratives are interchangeable. Kashmir becomes Gaza, it becomes the open-air concentration camp. And it's a little hard, a little bit confusing, because we tend to be saturated in all this propaganda about Israel. Everything there is really about Israel. Israel is destabilizing the entire Middle East. Without Israel, things would be completely different. Israel is a unique case. The way the Muslim terrorists are attacking Israelis October 7th, it's a unique result of all the horrors that the Israelis have inflicted on them. Nonsense. In fact, we see that Israel is interchangeable with India. It's interchangeable with any other country in the world that is targeted by Islamic terrorists. Now, the trick that Islamic terrorists play, because ordinarily you would go, wait a minute, there's one ideology, one religion, it's a war with Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, any religion you can name, the Yazidis, for goodness sake, a group that people had hardly ever heard of. If you can think of it, there was recently an Afghan violence happening in Amish country, in Pennsylvania Amish country. We joke about the Amish did it. Well, you can actually, there is no group that Islamic terrorists, there's Muslim violence does not leave alone. And yet people do not realize this. So the way they do not realize this is to make every single country they're targeted seem like a special case. And this, of course, is the uber special case. All the things that the Israelis have done to the nations, the ancient Palestinian people were invented in 1964. To dispossess them, to turn them into such monsters, and they're just lashing out because they've been so oppressed. Yet it turns out Kashmir is the same story, and it turns out that some guy in suburban Detroit is the same story, because it's not about Israel, it's not even about America, it's not about even the Western countries. India, any other country is absolutely a target. And the focus on, there's something specific, something unique in the history of Israel and its Muslim population. There's something specific and unique in Kashmir. There is not. The common pattern here is Islam. And the more they focus on any single country, the more we're supposed to miss that pattern. We're supposed to think, well, it's about Israel. Well, it's about India. Well, it's about how America reacted after 9/11. It's about something other. It's about the way that the French allow cartoons of Muhammad. It's not about any of those things. It is about a global ideology at war with the world. And Israel is unique in some cases because, one, Israel is surrounded by Islamic nations, but has withstood them for generation after generation. And it should be an inspiration to the world. European countries beleaguered by Islam, America after 9/11 should have looked at Israel and said, they've survived this, we can do this too. They've won so many wars against us despite being outgunned, outmanned, we can do this too. And of course, the great weapon against Israel is moral inversion. So the things that Israel does right, the things that people should admire Israel for, becomes the thing, the indictment. So Israel faced genocide, they accuse Israel of genocide. It's a very cheap trick. Once you see it everywhere. Israel should be an inspiration to the rest of the world about how to stand up to Islamic jihad. Instead, Israel becomes the model for how not to do it. We know much better how to do it. We know how to arrest terrorists and then have them in Gitmo, give them access to Harry Potter novels and 5-course meals, then send them to 5-star luxury terrorist rehab in Saudi Arabia. That's much better. Why are Israelis not doing that? You have all these Western leaders going, we don't understand what the Israeli purpose here is in Gaza. We don't understand this. It's baffling. To defeat the enemy nations that invaded Israel and killed thousands of its citizens. No, it's a no-brainer, but we've been brainwashed to the point where the obvious, where common sense is completely inaccessible to us. And they do that by, again, demonizing Israel. The more they demonize Israel, the fewer countries will actually take it as an example, and the more likely we, Western civilization, and really the rest of the world, certainly the United States, are to lose to Islam.
I'd say also it's not only I mean, you'll hear some of the more sophisticated argue, well, okay, that's all true, but Islam has been facing a tremendous humiliation now for decades, if not centuries. So these are all various manifestations of a larger sense of oppression and colonial assault. The problem is, what Daniel is describing isn't just horizontal over the Islam today. It's also vertical, Islam through time. So go to Morocco, 1033, massacre of the Jews of Fez. Go again 33 years later, 1066, a horrific massacre of all the Jews of Fez. Again and again, Fez again, as well as other cities in Morocco in the 15th century. Israel, go back to 1832, Tzfat, horrific massacre and forced conversions in Hebron in the 18th century, around the time of the creation of America. You just go horizontally through this, and it's a consistent pattern, not just vertically through this. It's a consistent pattern through time, not just horizontally today. So you really can't, I mean, the argument that this is some reaction is simply, it simply doesn't hold. And nor do Muslims claim it among themselves. I mean, that's what the chant Khaybar means, is to kill. It's a continuity since the first days of Islam to massacre the infidels, essentially, those who they want to massacre. So it isn't a reaction to anything. So what Dan says is much deeper than anything the current commentary deals with.
And just to put a fine point on it, the mantra in Islamic circles, the authorities of Islam specifically, hold that Muhammad is the perfect man. He's not just the prophet of the faith. He's not just the guy who, got the insights from the angel. He's the perfect man. His personal conduct is to be emulated. It is condoned. In fact, it is mandated to be what those who follow his faith, his beliefs, must do. And again, this is codified in Sharia. And so whether it's murder or rape or enslavement or conquest for booty or any of the other things that this 6th, 7th century brigand basically dressed up as somehow ordained by Allah has become the practice. And this you will be told is Islamophobic to point out. And hence, just as a lot of Muslims are reluctant to express any deviation from Sharia, a lot of non-Muslims are terrified into making any of these observations. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, it is not without downsides. But I can also tell you, you can't possibly defeat these enemies or their agenda or survive Western civilization without coming to grips with these realities. So I just want to say, part of the reason I truly love these two men sitting next to me and Pascal here is these are people who do truth-telling for a living. Not much of a living, but living. And I cannot commend them enough for doing it, and doing it in the face of universal, condemnation, it seems. And alas, and it must be said, alas, even witnessing a man who I believe probably everybody in this room voted for to be the President of the United States at this critical moment, in the conviction that he actually had a grip on this. And I want to commend to you something because it's a touchstone for me. On the 15th of August in 2016, I believe it happens to have been the first speech that Donald Trump gave as the Republican presidential nominee after Steve Bannon came to office as his campaign manager or strategist or whatever they called him. That speech, delivered in Youngstown, Ohio, also had another attribute that I think was unique of all the speeches that Donald Trump has given since he entered politics. He read the whole thing. No deviations, no stories, no distractions. He read the whole thing verbatim. And if you read it, it is absolutely brilliant and describes what we're talking about here in a lucid and accurate way, because it's talking about an ideology that we're up against. Now, he happened to call it radical Islamic terrorism. I don't think that's as accurate as Sharia supremacism. Some of my friends will just call it Islam. But whatever you call it, you've got to understand that the ideology that is animating this thing has its roots in the perfect man and some of the most evil behavior known to man. You get that right, and you're likely to be able to get most of the rest of it right. You get that wrong, and unfortunately, you get just about everything else perilously wrong. So welcome to Islamophobia. But, just a quick word on that, and I'll stop. As Dr. Weiner knows, a phobia is an unfounded fear of something. Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing unfounded about fear of Sharia and its proponents. In fact, as I said earlier, the very essence of Sharia is to invoke terror through violent jihad by emulating the practices of Muhammad. So, if you enter into this arena, some of you I know are already in it, thankfully. So, please know that that's something that you will probably be slandered by. Also know that if you actually understand what we're facing, along the lines of what we've been talking about, you're on absolutely solid ground. And your fear is justified and intentional. Yes.
Yeah. I don't want to talk a lot about Europe. I want to talk more about us and the United States and what all this means to us and why it's an American national security issue. But it seems like Europe, with all deliberate mindfulness, has chosen to embrace that thing that hates them. It's obviously committing suicide in every possible way. And now we're seeing President Macron, who, was that a great video, by the way, on the plane? Just saying. Is calling for a two-state solution, which, as we've just heard, is completely preposterous, and not because Israel is problematic, but because Israel is everything evil to them, and they've committed to wiping it off the face of the earth. Anything about, it's really difficult as someone who loves various countries in Europe deeply. What is going on there? Are they, it's Islamophobia phobia or something. Any idea
Look, it's
what they're doing?
submission.
It's submission.
That's the literal meaning of the word Islam. They are submitting. Not all of them, but the vast majority, certainly their governments are. And as these guys can tell you better than I, this is the trajectory we're on. We're just not quite as far along, thank God, on it, but it's the same playbook.
Yeah.
And when you look at what they're doing in response to the rising aggressiveness of, yes, Sharia supremacists, many of them imported, thanks to the Turks, by the millions from countries all over that map. You see the pattern of how the non-Muslim world is supposed to behave in the face of the power and the authority and the jihad of Islam. And again, Karen, I think it's really important that we talk about that, because you can watch it in action. And Macron is just one of those who is calling for submission. And I think it's fair to say, and I would defer to these guys, but my guess is that more than one of the countries you love, and many of us love, is at the cusp of civil strife on a massive scale, and quite possibly civil war.
Yeah.
As people finally, with their backs against the wall, non-Muslims, resist. But it will not be thanks to the leadership of their governments, I don't think, because most of the people who might resist are not being allowed to be in the government.
That's right.
Did you want to comment on any of that?
Well, another factor is money. You know, we mentioned Qatar recently. Prince Charles, back when he was still prince, was caught with £1 million, I believe it was £1 million, in a suitcase from Qatar. That's the level of vulgarity. You know, we're worried about the Qataris now buying up the United States. We're worried about them, by the way, having a presence in Beverly Hills for a very local issue. The presence that they have in England, in France, is mind-blowing. It is beyond that. They got in through oil companies, just the way they did with us, but they have been buying up real estate. They've been buying up politicians. They bought the King of England, for goodness sake. They're just able to hand out money to corrupt everybody because they simply are very corruptible, and that's something that's been a major problem for Europe. And of course, they're also terrified. They decided that the best way to avoid Islamic terrorism is to sell out Israel. There's two kinds of diplomacy. One kind of diplomacy is saying nice doggy until you find a stick. They've gone the other way. It's the feeding somebody else to the crocodile in the hopes that he'll eat you last. And there was at some point where European diplomacy was still nice doggy. Now it's strictly feeding the crocodile.
Wow. Well said. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this Qatar thing, there's a lot. The collapse of European civilization in the face of this Islamic threat internally, it probably is a lot like Jew hatred. It has quite a few attributes to it, or a few causes to it. But in a specific sense, you see Qatar use money, again, to Turkey. Turkey is really the structure through which you see a lot of the radicalization in Europe. There's two specific structures among Turkish expatriates in Europe. They have a replica of the Justice Party, Erdogan's party, which is enforcing loyalty and lots of money, of course, to make it work. So Turks are under sort of a Turkish structure, and then Muslims are using the Muslim Brotherhood structure, creating parties that replicate Muslim Brotherhood parties in the region. So that way they can radicalize Muslims that aren't Turks. And that's operating in Europe. It's been operating in Europe for quite a few years. And again, it's been Turkish money, but Turkey doesn't have money. And this gets to the core of the issue, which is Qatar has money, but it's not a real country. Turkey's a real country, but it doesn't have money. So what you see is essentially Turkey has become the rent-a-caliph or rent-a-sultan. Literally, it's rented by Qatar to be a real country. And of course, Erdogan himself has these imperial aspirations. So he's not just willing, he's a full partner in this. So this is the structure, and then you see where the huge flow of immigration came in over the last decade. The big immigration, a bit of it came from North Africa, but a very big part of it came through the Balkans, from Turkey. And it was a spigot that they would use for two purposes. One is to force Europe into backing off policies they didn't want by threatening mass immigration and then releasing it anyway occasionally in order to flood Europe with Syrian refugees, with Iraqi refugees, all sorts of refugees. So really that's part of the core structure. Now you say Libya, well, North Africa, that's been the other part. Again, who is in Libya? Where's it coming from? It's coming from the government in Tripoli. It's not coming from the area of Benghazi or eastern Libya, which is under Haftar and the Egyptians. It's coming from the west, which is under the control of, again, Turkish forces are there, and it's a Turkish-oriented government. So once again, you really vector back to Qatar. Now, I don't mean to let these other countries like Saudi Arabia off the hook. I think on that issue, I think this whole attempt to court them has to stop, but that's a whole different issue. What we have with Qatar and Turkey, we have to wake up to the fact that this is an internal threat to the West. It isn't an external irritant.
And we will definitely talk more about Qatar and Iran in a bit, but I before we go there, talk a little bit about this new president of Syria, who is, quote, former terrorist, al-Jilani. He seems to be playing both sides against the middle. He's courting us, courting Israel, but to what extent is any of this actually legitimate? How trustworthy is this man who appears to have, Frank's words, changed his spots?
Those are not my words. I don't think he changed his spots at all.
No. You would put it that way, but no, I know you don't.
Just for the record.
For the record, yes. And
David's got a great insight into this guy.
Okay, we've had communists and we've had Islamic jihadists leave their posture of radicalism, and you see it. Communists, when they left communism, there was no third way. It was an on-off switch, and when it was off, you knew it. You could see it. Similarly with the jihadists, we all heard of the Green Prince. You know, that's a switch that turned off, and he went all the way the other way. I have yet to really meet a communist who just moderated and is still a communist. Mm-hmm. I have yet to meet a jihadist that moderated and is still a jihadist or an Islamist. So I think it's fake. But even if you give him, the person, the credit, then you've got the structure under him, which is entirely ISIS and HTS, which is Al-Qaeda. His defense minister is a butcher, and the proof's in the pudding. Who is closest to the fire? It's the Druze, it's the Christians in Syria, it's the Christians in Lebanon, it's the Alawites, it's the Kurds. Not one of them believes this government in Syria is moderate. Not one of them is giving up their weapons. They're closest to the flame, and they feel the heat, and they're not giving up their weapons. And that tells you everything you need to know. Because for them, most of them can't really fight this. They would give up their weapons and try to integrate if they could. That's the way of the Druze. The Druze, they're tough people, but they try to live with the governments as they are. They live within the framework of the existing authority. They don't want to, and that tells you everything you need to know. So that's the second part of Julani or Ahmed Ashara. The third part is, even if he wanted to be moderate and his movement was moderating, you put an Arab Islamist government in Damascus, you've basically released the Kraken. It is where the Umayyad Caliphate began, the true, pure faith. That is when you hear Salaf, or the first generations of pure Muslims. That is the pure dynasty, the first dynasty, starting with with Muawiyah, who was the third caliph's cousin. So we're talking the first few years of Islam, the civil war before it went, and so forth. So you plant this in Damascus, you have signaled that the purity of Islam has returned to the seat of its birth. Not Mecca, Damascus. And that evokes across the region, even if those in Damascus don't want that, it evokes across the region a fervor, a feeling that finally Allah has graced the Muslims with purity, or the Muslims have become pure enough that now Allah has graced them the return to the Umayyad Caliphate and the expansion. So there is an emotive symbolism to returning to Damascus, an Islamic government that is electric across the region. I just read this morning the Israelis are seeing a sudden rise among ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Galilee, and also in Nablus and in Tulkarm. And they're all saying, because the Umayyads are back. They're all looking at Damascus. And Julani doesn't have to do a thing. It's just the emotive thing.
No, but David, you told me earlier today that he had rather explicitly played to that.
Yeah, he played to it. Where was the first place when he arrived in Damascus he went to? He went to the Umayyad Mosque. And there he gave a speech from the pulpit that Muawiyah, the founder of the Umayyad Caliphate, gave his speech from to declare the Umayyad Caliphate. So he deliberately went there and deliberately spoke from the pulpit to deliberately tie the parallel to the rise of the Umayyad Caliphate. So again, you can give him a lot of benefit of doubt, but his behavior doesn't suggest it's warranted, number one. Number two, the actions on the ground tell you it's not warranted. Three, all those surrounding this flame are terrified and know it. And then four, even if it was, and you give them the benefit of the doubt, there's a fire that's been lit regionally by this, and it's very dangerous.
Wow. Daniel, you've been writing about this also recently, although you've been writing about everything recently. Do you want to add to that? Because that was a great, very terrifying perspective on what's going on. You're
In Syria in particular.
in Syria,
Well,
or how it's connected to the whole rest of the threat.
Well, the true madness is that when ISIS first rose, there was a universal consensus that we had to stamp it out. That its messianic ideology, its conviction that it could actually rebirth the caliphate, was horrifyingly destructive to civilized norms, to the Muslim world, to everybody. And now we're all kind of sanctifying it and signing off on what is effectively an al-Qaeda state in Syria, run by a guy who had ties to ISIS, run by people who have their own connections to al-Qaeda and to ISIS, and who are, as David very succinctly summed up, really are embodying this entire messianic prophecy that ISIS had been based on. And by the way, this has serious consequences, not just for Israel, it has serious consequences for the United States. Still, the most prevalent form of Islamic terrorism in the United States comes from these so-called lone wolves, they're not really lone wolves, who are motivated by allegiance to ISIS. Now, if you think there's an upsurge in terrorism and ISIS affiliations in parts of Israel and the Galilee, there's going to be an upsurge in America. We might not see it overnight, but it's definitely going to be there because now they've had this big payoff. After Trump smashed them pretty thoroughly in the first administration, they are making a comeback. They have been making a comeback very effectively operating in Afghanistan. They now have a comeback in Syria, and it's been implemented, I would say literally implemented by Turkey, which outrightly had been backing ISIS for quite a while, somewhat covertly, now is openly backing them. And you have the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, who now sounds like the Turkish ambassador to the United States, delivering this bellicose rant, damning the West and saying, there needs to be this unity under Arab, Sunni, Muslim rule in Syria, and there can be no splintering whatsoever. So effectively, the United States is somehow doing the bidding of the backers of ISIS and overseeing this al-Qaeda-ISIS state in Syria. And this is utter madness, and we should be concerned about it, not just because of destabilization in the Middle East, but destabilization, violence, terrorism in the United States.
Amen.
Wow.
Can I just pick up on that point? Because this is one I'm particularly passionate about. Daniel's exactly right. As I said on that bit about Europe and the trajectory we're on, I don't know if anybody's been in Texas lately, but people are getting pretty spun up about the increasing aggressiveness of Sharia supremacist Muslims, specifically in a couple of places, notably around Dallas, where they're putting in place on some 420 acres, as I recall, something called Epic City, East Plano Islamic Center City, a Muslim Brotherhood community of 1,000 homes built around one or more mosques, for the purposes of creating what, if you are paying attention to Europe, will be familiar to you as a no-go zone. It is a Sharia compliant, Sharia adherent, Sharia practicing complex. And again, going back to the perfect man, mosques in Muhammad's time and ever after are not houses of worship, certainly not houses of worship alone. And when you look at what is being built in East Plano, you will see, I believe, a multi-use facility, which is the tradition. Some of the uses being, yes, religious observance and community-centered activities and very social and communal activities. But they're also typically arsenals. Mm-hmm. They're training centers for the use of weapons, firing ranges included in some of them. And we've been giving them a pass. Israel has, as you know, been now accused of war crimes for, among other things, taking down mosques and hospitals and schools in Gaza, for example. Why is that? Well, because those, it turns out, are exactly the places that these emulators of the perfect man were using to put their troops, put their headquarters, put their intelligence centers, put their arms. So again, much of what you are told, as Karen said at the beginning, about so much of this is not true. And the people that are telling it to you typically are convinced of its veracity. and will not believe you when you say otherwise. Just know that this is a problem that is no longer afflicting Israel. It is no longer afflicting the Middle East. It is no longer afflicting all of that and Europe. It is here. And it is going to be the challenge for our time. I believe in this generation that we're going to confront similar kinds of threats emerging from these communities to the non-Muslim population. And we're also predicted, take it to the bank, going to see people who are saying, we have to accommodate this. And not least they're going to say, we're going to have to accommodate it because we have as a cornerstone of our Constitution religious freedom. And these guys understand brilliantly that that is a get-out-of-jail-free card in the United States of America. To some extent in Europe, but it's not enshrined in constitutions as it is here. There you just see people submitting. Here you will see people submitting using the pretext that they're entitled to do whatever they want in houses of worship, no matter how dangerous it may be, how actually incipiently violent it is, how perhaps unconstitutional it is. And there's a wonderful tract, and I really commend it to everybody. The Center for Security Policy, I know, has it on their website. You can download it for free at securefreedom.org. It's a publication called The Explanatory Memorandum on the General Strategic Goal of the Group in North America. Interestingly, it was found in a safe house in Annandale, Virginia, not far from where I live, in an FBI raid. It turned out it was not just another suburban home, it was a suburban home that was used as the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America. And this document, which as I recall was written in 1991, essentially lays out the program of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States. One passage of which is particularly important. It says the mission of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America is, quote, destroying Western civilization from within by their hands, meaning the unbelievers, and the believers, so that Allah's religion is made victorious over all other religions, unquote. Now that was introduced into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest trial, terrorism financing trial in US history. Used to convict 5 of the principals in the Holy Land Foundation, which is a now dismantled charity raising funds for Hamas. And a couple of the Muslim Brotherhood front organizations that you may have heard of, the Council on American Islamic Relations, for example, CARE, the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, the North American Islamic Trust, NATE, appealed to the judge to have their names removed from the list of unindicted co-conspirators, some 300 of whom were in the official paperwork of the trial. And about 20 of them were listed by name in this explanatory memorandum. And the judge said, no, the government has provided sufficient evidence to demonstrate you are associated with the Holy Land Foundation and its fundraising for a designated terrorist organization that Israel is, please God, about to put out of its misery. the old-fashioned way.
So, so I want to turn to to President Trump, who just completed a diplomatic tour of the region and engaged in conversations with, as you had mentioned, various of the countries, but he also came back using wielding economic levers with Qatar, talking about another nuclear deal with Iran. These have raised a fair amount of anxiety, the new Air Force One and so on. The idea of using economic levers is not a new one, and the idea of engaging in commerce and being transactional among heads of state in order to keep the peace is not new at all. What are your thoughts about President Trump negotiating with Qatar? And then I want to get to Iran, but let's talk about Qatar first.
Well, as I said, I think that Qatar is clever in insinuating itself as a friend of the United States in order to destroy it, to get inside the tent. It's maybe as we go along, the key form of politics in the Middle East is really the 1001 Nights. It's a story that is actually banned from being published in most Arab countries because it is so indicative of what it is, which is manipulation, and that's Qatar. As far as the money goes, this is the problem. There is really a strong need in the West. You can see a lot of Western leaders, whether it's Macron, whether it's President Trump right now with trying to get through this difficult passage as he's with tariffs and so forth, he's trying to retool the economy, and that's going to have dislocation. And the key is how to get through that period of dislocation. Of course, there's Qatar happily trying to help. And Macron, I'm not going to mince my words. I think it's corruption. I think it's outright corruption. I think there was corruption behind the Israeli Lebanon maritime agreement on the eve of the war on October 7th. This was done only in October 2022. I think it can't be explained. It can't rationally be explained. That agreement cannot rationally be explained without corruption being a major factor. And I had go-rounds with Israeli generals, with all sorts of people in Israel who simply suspended their rationality. And I came to the conclusion it really had to do with Fin Total and Macron and the rights to the fields. And again, you get to Qatar. It wasn't the fields themselves, the gas fields that are offshore in Lebanon, because nobody knew if they were real, and nobody knew if they were real how big they are. What it was that Qatar wanted to bring pipelines through Syria and to this was when Qatar was still aligned well with Iran, that they would bring it through Assad, Syria, and then through Lebanon to the shore, and in that way, France would be through Fin Total would create a gas hub offshore, which would service Europe in the wake of the Ukrainian invasion, and that's what was really behind that maritime deal, is to unlock the conundrum of Hezbollah control and so forth, and all the rationalizations followed. So I think it's corruption with that, but your question was essentially about the Qataris, or do you want Trump?
Trump negotiating with the Qataris as a means of staving off.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to get what he thinks he's going to get from Qatar. I think he and you're beginning to see it. I mean, yes, Syria, he's going along with it. Yes, holding off on the Iranians. Apparently, the Qataris implored him not to do anything on Iran. You're seeing that. Yes, Qatar said, stop the Israelis from finishing the war in Gaza, we'll get the hostages out, and so forth. Qatar's failing, or maybe not failing, it was double dealing. It never intended any of those things. It was still helping Iran cross the threshold. It's still helping save Hamas. It's still helping save Jelani by trying to infuse him with Western money and so forth. So I think ultimately President Trump will realize this pretty soon, and he'll come around on it. Unfortunately, there are powerful forces in the conservative movement that he needs to deal with. It's not an easy navigation for him to, and we can name names, people like Tucker Carlson and so forth. It is not easy to navigate the atmosphere in Washington right now, and I see him carefully trying to navigate it, and it leads to certain places. But I think in the end, Trump is still where he's mostly been. I think that there are some minor or some misalignments with Israel over timing, but not a real rupture. I would take all the press accounts you hear, not listen to them. That there is actually far more alignment still than one thinks. But there is a difference over timing that is out there, and it's a rational difference. I can see both sides of it. The Israelis are in a timeline of weeks, both in Gaza and in Iran, specifically Iran. America is on a timeline of 3 to 5 months. There are reasons for it, but I think in the end, if it comes to the point where Israel feels it needs to act, I still think Trump will have Israel's back.
Right.
Can I just add a point? We've experimented with this idea that you can essentially commercialize your relationship with another nation and transform them from being a serious problem into, if not an ally, exactly, certainly benign nation, maybe a competitor. Karen talked about our Victory Coalition. One of the other coalitions that our Institute for the American Future sponsors is one I'm very proud of, called the Committee on the Present Danger, China. And it's now generally accepted, I think, even in Washington, that this hasn't worked out. The idea that we would make them rich and they would be like us has pretty much come a cropper. And if you think that is so, I would suggest to you that people who have at least as much of an ideological fervor about them as do the Chinese communists, namely the Sharia supremacists, are not going to be wooed into becoming more like us, or at least more benign. Especially because, and I think both David and Daniel have alluded to this, at least, if not said it as much in these words, they think they're winning. People don't stop doing what they're doing, especially when they believe in it passionately. They think God is on their side. They think God is actually impelling them and will give them the victory. But if they're winning, they sure are not going to give up, which is why, in response to this lady's observation, I pray Donald Trump is going to have Israel's back as it finishes the job with respect to Gaza. And more to the point, to come back to something you said we would come back to, finishes the job with respect to Iran.
Yeah.
Because if it doesn't get done now, I don't know that it's going to get done. And there is a window of opportunity, and Daniel and David can speak to this more authoritatively than I. There is a window of opportunity now, thanks in part to what the Israelis did to the Iranian regime after it attacked them the last time, to take down their air defenses and otherwise greatly diminish the power of the regime. But what's needed now is to crush the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that keeps the Iranian regime in power. And I believe, and David, I want you to specifically speak to this, if not Daniel, the evidence that the Iranian people are champing at the bit again to liberate themselves from these miserable bastards. Oh, yes, we've had our issues with, to be sure, but nothing like what the people of Iran have had to put up with for the past 40 plus years. So this is a matter of common sense, ladies and gentlemen. As I said earlier, Donald Trump has promised us that that's what he's going to be animated by. He gave that fabulous speech back in 2016, which clearly stated the nature of the enemy. And by the way, he talked about in that speech not just defeating the ideology, but rolling up its support networks here as well. And I would say that that means the Muslim Brotherhood infrastructure that we talked about earlier, but also the Iranian infrastructure and Hezbollah's that is here. These are ticking time bombs, ladies and gentlemen. And we've got to get about that right quick.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Iran's a wounded cobra. It's terribly wounded. But you can't turn your back on a wounded cobra. So we talked a lot about Qatar and Turkey, but that threat still is there. It's, I think, capable of being crushed very soon. But it needs to be crushed very soon because these other threats emerging, it's almost impossible to deal with all of them unless you finish this right now with the Iranians. And that gets to a point about Israel. I think there has been in Israel for many years a misconception that the best way to secure American support is to give in, to work with the United States, to give in to the United States, et cetera, by governments here, whether it's from Jimmy Carter all the way to Joe Biden, who really aren't, the State Department diplomats who are telling Israel, if you give in, aren't really doing it in good faith. Israel's strongest ally in the United States is popular society, is American society, and its projection onto Israel an image of itself. So it looks for in Israel values that it values for itself, which include self-reliance. If you really believe that your existence is on the line, you don't ask permission to fight for your existence. You just do it. Look at every Western, what sort of values are represented by that. And that's what made Israel popular, and that's what really grounded Israeli support in the United States. In addition to some of the Judeo-Christian things, but there's also that image of Israel operates the way we ourselves always wished we ourselves operate. So my sense is Israel got too much in the habit of asking for permission, too much in the habit of deferring, and that's a whole different subject. I think it goes back to 1970, the war of attrition. It's an hour-long conversation about Israel's strategic failure over the last 40, 50 years in that. But that said, October 7th represented a collapse of that strategic image. And all of a sudden, the Israelis realized how alone they are. But strategically, it takes time for the institutions to adjust. The IDF, even the political echelon, even Prime Minister Netanyahu to some extent. So what I'm hoping, and I'm thinking is the case, is that Netanyahu understands that the best way to actually secure American support is to go ahead and do what Israel needs to do when it needs to do it. Because that is what will anchor fundamental respect. And I think President Trump ultimately would rather see that than simply somebody he can push around.
Yeah. Before I ask my next question, I guess, I just wanted to, is there anything more specifically on the topic of Iran negotiating a new nuclear deal and so on? Are there? All right, then my question is,
Oh, well,
yeah, go ahead.
Daniel, are you not going to say anything?
Well, I would say that there's a fundamental misapprehension that there's even anything to negotiate with Iran. So Iran has pursued its nuclear program with costs in trillions of dollars in sanctions. It's done that. Why has it done that? Now, the premise of negotiations, the current negotiations, past negotiations, is that there's a distinction between a civilian and a military Iranian nuclear program. A civilian nuclear program is we want to save money on our electric bill, so we want cheap nuclear power. There's a bit of a problem here because Iran is not France, it's not Germany. The cost of electricity in the United States is relatively medium. In California, it's huge because, of course, we use energy efficient solar panels that work very well at night, right about now. Now, the cost of electricity in Iran per kilowatt hour is a tiny fraction of what it is in the United States. It's like 0.0, a whole lot of zeros, 4 cents per kilowatt hour. We pay a whole lot more for electricity than Iran does. Now, why does Iran get electricity so cheaply? They could just get it coming out of the ground. They don't have to answer to the Sierra Club or any environmental groups. So Iran does not remotely need a civilian nuclear program. It's got very cheap power right now. So any negotiations premised on the idea that Iran wants a civilian nuclear program are doomed to fail. And if we pursue them, we just look like idiots. We are telling the Iranians that we are suckers. Because when you come up to the Iranians and say, well, we'll let you have your civilian nuclear program, just don't enrich the uranium. The Iranians at that point realize that you're idiots and you don't know what you're talking about and you can be taken advantage of. So every time we humiliate ourselves by getting into negotiations with Iran, we just actually expose our own vulnerability. Beyond the nuclear threat, beyond the nuclear program, we make it clear that we are not serious, that we should not be taken seriously, and that obviously has bad implications beyond the nuclear program for the United States, for our national security. Which means if we're not going to do anything about Iran's nuclear program, at the very least, for God's sake, stop embarrassing ourselves by trying to negotiate with Iran and falling for their fiction or pretending to fall for it, that what they want is cheaper electricity.
Wow, yeah. So if you were to counsel Bibi Netanyahu, what would you advise at this juncture?
Coming from the East Coast, we just unfortunately had the Sit Shiva and Barry and then Sit Shiva for Michael Ledeen. So we've had David Horowitz and Michael Ledeen both die in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, both of whom were very similar but very amazing. And the reason why I raised Michael Ledeen is because he ended so many of his articles about Iran with the word faster, please. And I think that's the advice I'd give Netanyahu, which is do what you have to do it decisively, and do it faster.
Oh, that's great. Daniel, what would you counsel Bibi Netanyahu?
I couldn't top that, but the bottom line is politicians have this tendency to kick the can down the road. You know, we accuse politicians of being warmongers, of acting without thinking. The reality is most politicians are comfortable just actually waiting and seeing. We're out of time for waiting and seeing.
Yeah.
I think all of us believe that Bibi's basically got the right idea, which goes to Michael Ledeen's point and David's. Just do it. What I'm, again, to just emphasize this point, what's as important to me as what we might say to Bibi is what we should say to President Trump. And I'd like to think, it's a thought experiment, but in looking at what the president has done with these negotiations and with these embraces of Qataris and so on, and the stories that suddenly, were everywhere, that the president is at odds with Bibi, that he's broken with Bibi, that their relationship is over. I'm prayerful, again, but I have a sneaking suspicion this is about creating plausible deniability. That in fact the message is going to be privately, just do what you have to do. Get it done. For heaven's sakes, get it done. And the United States is not going to interfere with it as it would have under Biden. It may or may not overtly and publicly and, you know, in a decisive way help. But at the end of the day, if they're not trying to take out deeply buried, hardened, and not altogether known nuclear facilities, but they're going after relatively soft bases and networks and control facilities and so on of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Israelis can do that themselves, I'm quite certain. And it sounds as though, from my duty experts on the subject, they know they have to do it now. So my prayer would simply be, Mr. President, let them do it.
Yeah. So you had answered my next question, which is, what would you counsel President Trump to do? David?
Yeah, I would say let him do it. I think, you know, President Trump has made it very clear that, you know, we've got two big problems. We've got a military that has been worn down and not very, not at the height of its power, and we have so we have limited global power at the same time that we have a very large problem in Asia, and so he's both because of exhaustion with Middle Eastern wars, but also because of our power realities, he wants to de-emphasize the Middle East. But there's only one way you can de-emphasize the Middle East without it turning into retreat and weakness and causing yet further problems. And that's to have allies in the region that are perceived as and actually are strong. And there's no ally in the region that represents America as much as Israel does. So it really is essential American interest to ensure that Israel emerges from this round of conflict with Iran powerful and seen to be powerful in the region, because that is how we withdraw from the Middle East without it being seen to be a retreat. And the only way to do that is not a negotiated semi-kicking down the can settlement with Iran or frankly, Gaza. And it's painful because unfortunately there is somewhat of a choice here between the remaining 20 hostages who are alive and the strategic imperative of winning this war decisively in Gaza. And I think it's true that there's a good shot that forcing a collapse of Hamas could lead to a flood of some of the remaining 20 coming out, simply as individuals cut their deals or whatever. And I sincerely hope that. But in terms of a diplomatic solution, it is a stark one. If it's negotiated, it is Israel either loses the war, Gaza war, which has catastrophic implications for both the United States and Israel in the long run, or the hostages. And that's why I think Bibi's trying to find that third way of collapsing Hamas carefully but decisively. But for the United States, it's absolutely imperative that Israel not come out of this looking weak and not coming out of this with a strategic defeat. And I think that there has been some slippage in that, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's with Giuliani, as we mentioned, certainly with the negotiations with Iran, and even now where it's not clear the United States wants Israel to just go ahead, do it, finish it. I think they do, but Israel has to realize, to me, it's the only way the United States can also square the circle between its commitment and its interests in the region and its withdrawal from the region.
Great, thank you. Daniel, what would you counsel the president to do?
Well, we're kind of in a half and half territory right now. We have a country that is quite understandably weary of Middle Eastern wars. We've heard the arguments of wars without a defined mission, but those really weren't, it's important to remember, those really were not wars. There were peacekeeping operations, there were regime change operations, there were democracy building, there were, as I think, the Obama administration at one point renamed the Iraq War Advise and Assist, heroically. There were medals handed out for advising and assisting. That's actually what we were doing in the latter years in the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. We were supposed to be trying to prop up these various warlords and terrorists themselves to function on their own, to build countries. And of course, that was never going to happen. And plenty of people in and out of the military have been burned out and disgusted by it. What we have not tried is actually winning a war decisively, quickly, and simply. And that is really the key missing ingredient. We briefly flirted with doing that after 9/11. Our initial operations in Afghanistan were brilliant and effective and simple, and they were aimed at the mission of destroying the terrorists involved. We have not really done that since. We did that a little bit under Trump, first time around, when he went after ISIS, which is, again, engage in the destruction of the enemy. And we are really not doing that. Instead, what we've been doing is democracy building. And we've kind of roped that together, the idea that wars are unwinnable because democracy building is unwinnable, and the two actually do not follow together. What we've been doing is the same failed strategy of democracy building that we adopted really after World War II, and we confused that idea. We did not win World War II by democracy building. We did not go into Germany and Japan. We did not defeat Hitler and Tojo through democracy building. We began democracy building after we thoroughly defeated and destroyed them. And those were countries that had histories of democracy. They had cultural openness to be functioning like a civilized society. And that's not the case in most of the wars we were doing. Instead, we became addicted to this idea of stabilizing and building up these various countries, and we forgot how to fight wars, and now we're forgetting the idea that there is such a thing as a winnable war. We think that wars can no longer be won. We're hearing these speeches, including from some people in the Trump administration, that wars are basically unwinnable now. Who can even win wars anymore? Thousands of years of human history, apparently wars since then became unwinnable. What's the secret? What's the secret of Napoleon? What's the secret of George Washington? What's the secret of Valley Forge? Well, you actually fight to win, and we're no longer fighting. We're not even fighting to win. We're not fighting at all. So I am completely supportive of the idea that we should be engaged in fewer military conflicts. We should have fewer troops abroad. We should be disengaging from a lot of this nation building, from a lot of the global infrastructure, and that we should actually be fighting decisive actions. But we're dropping the decisive actions part also. We're dropping the actual fighting to win part. When in the face of terrorists attacking us, in the face of enemies who declare death to America, we're thinking of, let's negotiate this. And that's not make America great again. That's the Obama administration all over again. It's an absolute mistake. There are people in the Trump administration who are pushing that, including one who actually served under Obama. And those people are mistaken. They're pushing a mistaken ideology. And I think President Trump is right to be skeptical about it. He's playing the field right now, and that's always been his way. He plays the field. He looks at various options. But at the end of the day, the common sense approach, as Frank very importantly laid out, the common sense approach is to, if you're going to actually be faced with enemies, then fight to win.
Yeah. Amen. Frank, you want to add something to President Trump?
Oh, I think I said it at the outset, that particular round.
Yeah.
let Israel do it. And I don't mean to make it sound as though, they need our permission. But they prefer to have our permission, that's for sure. But I do want to just say, at the risk of stating the complete obvious, thank God Joe Biden, or whoever is supposed to be Joe Biden, is not running the United States government at this moment in time.
My question to you, before we go to those, is we talked before about how so many among us are ignorant. Everything that they know isn't so. We're fighting against a sea of misinformation, disinformation, inversion. What are the 2 or 3 things that you think we need to take away as things that are truths that we need to embrace with complete confidence and go forth and multiply these ideas? Are there 2 or 3 particular nuggets of truth that we need to disseminate against the flood of the false narratives about everything that we've been talking about?
Well, certainly Israel, but I think Israel's part of the whole. The West is good.
Yeah.
The West is good. It's been good all along. The culmination in 1776 was a great moment in human history. Did we have flaws? Yeah, we all do. Have we fixed them? Not all of them, but we're on the way. The central attack on the West is to seize one or two or three flaws and make it what the West is, and completely ignore all the good it is, and completely ignore all the bad that we faced. And so if there's one thing that, and it's true, you know, we've got a real problem in this country, that our situation is our universities have failed, our press has failed, structures of credentialing, education, and knowledge have failed. And young people look at that and they don't trust anything anymore. The problem is you can't live, you can't make decisions without knowledge, you can't make decisions without information. But there's no structure they can turn to understand that. So to me, one of the most important things to bring to their attention is, first of all, to understand this country is a good country. And it was founded on good principles. It isn't the 1619 Project. It wasn't founded in sin. It isn't some clever way of perpetuating sin. And the West as a whole, for 2,000 to 3,000 years, ever since Mount Sinai or Mount Moriah, has been on the positive path. That's number one. And number two, to build back to the classics on that. And unfortunately, I'm saying that they need to return to the things that they said that they don't trust. But I think we really got a problem where if you have people who feel that they can't trust the sources of information, then they're very vulnerable to what they hear from their communities. They trust their friends, their communities. That means any bad idea has legs, and you can't take it away, you can't undo it. Conspiracy theories, whatever. So I think we've got a real problem, and this is, in my view, one of the most important threats to American security there is the collapse of our structures of knowledge and our structures of credentialing and our structures of education, because our youth are lost, and they don't know where to go to fix it. So to me, that would be one of the first things that would need to be communicated. And yes, I mean, religion is good, but I even see there some deterioration of how it's understood.
Yeah, thank you. Daniel?
I would actually affirm that the West is good, specifically within the context of the Muslim world, because we've adopted so many of these colonialism narratives. They've been prevalent on the left, obviously. They're now starting to take hold on the right to some degree, that Western interventions, American interventions, really created all the problems in the Middle East, which is complete nonsense. And it's also important to remember that within the context of the military and the strategic dimensions, since the 50s at the very least, the Muslim world, the Arab world, has not been reacting to us, we've been reacting to them. Everything that's been going on, including the last 25, 30 years, has been our reaction to Muslim incursions, Muslim invasions, Muslims attacks on the United States. And I would just, David mentioned previously the vertical view of history. I would just note a minor point. It was Islamic jihad that resulted in the creation of the United States. Because why did Columbus actually why do we need to look for this alternative route to the Indies? Because the Turks, by the way, the Turks took Constantinople, cutting off our route to the Indies, so we needed to find a way around. And by the way, we discovered the United States. The Muslim world had been trying to strangle the European West. They'd been trying to surround it, to drive it into the sea, so to speak, for that era. Instead, actually, we took to the sea, we took to the oceans, and we changed the world. We built the modern West by escaping the trap that the Muslim world had built for us, and by creating the United States, by creating both Americas, and by, settling Australia and New Zealand, by building a global Western presence. And since the 50s, tragically, we've been receding, we've been retreating from that, we've been apologizing for it. We've been apologizing to the original colonialists, the original slave owners, those who wanted to enslave mankind, and those who, by the way, continue to have slavery today. We're apologizing for colonialism to the Muslim world. It's the, again, complete moral inversion. We should be proud of what we built. What we built was built in defiance of Islam. It was the ultimate form of human progress. It was the greatest shining light of human civilization, and we should fight to keep it burning.
Well, as Rush Limbaugh used to say, ditto. Let me just say, I think that what we've talked about tonight is, among other things, as a takeaway, we not only need to talk about the good that we do and strive to do, we need to talk about the evil as well with clarity, with a grasp of what is it, why is it evil, and what would it mean if it prevailed. And at the risk of making it sound disagreeable at the very end of an otherwise very agreeable conversation, I would disagree, and I don't think that it's a real disagreement, but David has said our institutions have failed. I would argue they've been taken down. Yeah. They've been overtly, deliberately, and patiently destroyed from within. And Gutter, your analogy of trying to burn down the tent from inside is a prime example of it. Where are our kids getting information? TikTok, among others. I mean, they are now trusting it as a news source. And again, one of the things I'm a little out of sorts with the president about is he seems determined to try to preserve it. Presumably, he will not allow it to remain in Chinese hands or using a Chinese algorithm or having the data go to China and so on. I pray that's the case. And maybe it will be. But if we can't fix that, and we can't recognize that Qatari money in our universities and Chinese money in our universities, and you know, there's this flap at the moment about Harvard University not being allowed to bring more foreign students in part justified by the fact that they have been coordinating with the Chinese Communist Party on campus. Well, ladies and gentlemen, every single one of those Chinese students, and there are about 270,000 of them on our campuses at the moment, across the country, has a legal obligation to do what the Chinese Communist Party directs them to do. If that's espionage, so be it. If it's recruitment, if it's subversion, if it's worse, they are on notice that they must do it. So this is hardly the incubator for the kind of love of our country and appreciation of its goodness and the necessity of its survival that it must be if we are to bequeath to future generations what we have been privileged to have in our time. And I know that's the purpose that brings you all here. And I just want to say thank you for being here and taking this aboard and hopefully being able to take away these kinds of points and act on them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I will add to that, because you all know I completely affirm that we need to take aboard and speak much more loudly and proudly and confidently and with the greatest of gratitude about our goodness, because kids today are learning that we are evil, and they are learning that what is evil is good, back to the moral inversion. So yes, we need to proclaim that, but I would also say that we need to be very clear that Chinese Communist Party has declared war on us, as has all these. The Sharia supremacists have very clearly stated they must take down Israel and the West. These are, as Frank has said in the past, these are what one calls clues. And we need to be very clear that they have been waging war on us, even if we don't acknowledge it. And as I have been wont to say...
Please, go there.
I shall.
This is one of her best slides.
Thank you. We all know the philosophical query, if a tree falls in the woods and there's nobody there to hear it, does it still make a sound? Yeah. Right? I have posited an analogous question. If you're at war, but nobody will acknowledge it, can you still lose? And we have been, and we had been, and we have absolutely been losing this war that they have been assiduously waging against us, while others are covering for it, namely the Democrat Party, the media, our educational institutions. Every one of our institutions that transmits culture refuses to acknowledge this and covers it up. We cannot allow that to continue. It has to be on us to share this. What happened November 5th of last year wasn't that these wars stopped, obviously, but it does mean that we got, to Frank's point, somebody in the Oval Office playing on our side, which we had not had for the prior 4 years. Amen. And I just, the word that I've been using over the last 4 years, meant much longer than that, is what's required of us is courage. And I still absolutely believe that, but I've taken on a new word in recent weeks, which is confidence. We need the confidence of our convictions that we are the good guys. We are not the bad guys. We need to be very clear. We are good. They are evil. Ronald Reagan had said it. Donald Trump says it. It's sort of inherent in America First. It's not just America First willy-nilly. It's because America is great and will be. We've always been great. We need to be even greater, and we need to take stronger positions. But each one of us, I think, if we take in our hearts the confidence that we are on the side of good, and they are on the side of evil, and Israel is with us on the side of good, and we are with Israel on the side of good. And I think he is on our side because we are on his side. So I just think we need to take that on board. So, we have some great questions. Frank, I'm just going to start with this one. Who wrote Trump's speech that he read that day? Where did he get that?
I don't know for sure, but I do think that Steve Bannon cribbed a lot of stuff from our writing on the subject. It sounded very familiar, but I don't know that for sure.
But it was very close to writings that had come out of your center. Yeah. Yeah.
It was great stuff. I don't care where it came from.
It was great stuff. There appears to be a totally different approach between Democrat support for Israel than Republican strength of support. How can we use Democrat willingness to protect Israel to get us to support action?
You see, I think the Democrats really are part of a larger tradition that is dominant in Washington that believes that Arab rage against the West is driven by grievance and humiliation. That therefore, we have to deliberately debase ourselves in order to show them we're not their enemy and mollify or alleviate their grievance and their rage. Whereas in point of fact, it's really the opposite. It's Arab rage is driven primarily by disdain, a sense that they are, they don't understand how they've retreated for 1,000 years. And so they come up with the excuse that they're not pure enough, which leads to a lot of this stuff. But most importantly, they're looking for signs that confirm their contempt for the West. So every time we blame ourselves and we retreat or try to show them how good we are, they read it as exactly the opposite. Their contempt is confirmed and it fuels the rage. And if you look at the historical record, the latter view, which is the one Bernard Lewis had, is I think correct. And I think that to some extent is the divide between the current Democratic Party view of how to deal with the Middle East and the Republican side, or at least most of the Republican side, which is there's a respect factor that drives our position in the region healthily. And Carter represented the opposite. What bothers me is you do have on the right this Blame America First crowd beginning to emerge. Well, it's Iraq. I mean, after Iraq, well, of course the Iranians hate us, or maybe Mossadegh. Well, of course, I'm not saying whether Ukraine is right or wrong, but I am saying that the argument that the entirety of it is blamable on the fact that we talked about NATO, it's not our fault. It's not our fault. Neither is Iranian hatred. And I think it all goes back to that central view that informs the Democratic Party. So where we might have an in is there is some level of support on the old school liberal side of the Democratic Party. If you can peel them away, there might be something there. But unfortunately, I think Washington as a whole is so dominant by this view that the Arab world is just oppressed and from the Crusades on, and they just feel grievance when, in point of fact, everything we do to fuel that idea worsens the problem.
Yeah.
Could I just add a slight wrinkle to that? The Middle East is a tribal society, and the hostility that is felt by people in tribes that are not the strongest towards those who are the strongest is vastly increased when the tribe that is the strongest doesn't seem to have the will to use its strength. So, to David's point, if you want to actually conduce to peace, if you want these tribes to not be at our throats, if you want them to recognize that their triumph is not preordained, you have to be strong. You have to be willing to use your strength. And if you are not, as David said, and I think this is an incredibly important thought, if you have made the corporate decision as a nation that you don't want to be in the Middle East as we have been, but you don't want to lose everything that's on the line there, including Israel, by the way, but also our other interests, then you better have somebody else that is strong and that is willing to demonstrate that they are the strongest tribe on your side. And that is not going to be Qatar, and that is not going to be the Saudis, and it sure as hell is not going to be the Turks. It's going to be Israel. And that's where we need to stand with them, I think, and their strength as well.
Do you want to add to that, Daniel?
I mean, I think Frank said it all, really.
Yeah, very powerful answer. Is Trump perhaps doing something behind the scenes to further the Abraham Accords? And what role are they playing in all of this? Venture a guess?
I don't know. I must tell you the single most disturbing thing that I took away from his travels in the Middle East was the statement to the effect, and I don't think it came from his mouth, but it came from somebody's, it might have been, that this Syrian Al-Qaeda president wants to have an Abraham Accord with Israel. I have a bridge in Brooklyn for anybody who's prepared to buy that. So I don't know. I mean, look, I think the Abraham Accords that we got were remarkable and were, I think, far better than I thought they would. Much as it pains me to say that anything Jared Kushner has done is useful, but there it is. But I don't see, I mean, look, the Saudi accord should have been done years ago. And I think the Biden administration deliberately screwed it up to prevent that from happening. Could it yet happen? I think so. Will it? I hope so. But some of these other characters are not good candidates for it, seems to me. But what do you guys think?
Well, the Abraham Accords were meant as really a hedge against Iran. The problem is that things in the region, particularly with Iran and the relationship of the Saudis and some other players to Iran, has changed. And obviously, yes, the idea of an al-Qaeda state joining the Abraham Accords makes a mockery of the whole concept. And it's pretty clear that really the expansion of the Abraham Accords is not happening in any meaningful way at this point. I think what really should have been done is the presentation of a new alliance concept. The Abraham Accords was the idea that there'd be some reapproachment with Israel and some Arab states. There may need to be a broader anti-Iran alliance, but it does seem like there's limited enthusiasm for that right now in the Middle East, in part because of us, because of the Biden administration, and in part because some of these countries are now seeing an Iranian nuke as inevitable and they're adapting to it. And unless we make it very clear that the Iranian nuke is not happening, then any hope for an Abraham Accords pretty much dies away.
The Abraham Accords were to some extent, sort of the genesis was actually in the Obama era, ironically because of Obama, which was that his weakness toward Iran so terrified the Saudis and the UAE that they fled to where they could find hope, which was Israel. They were hoping they could enlist Israel against Iran. That's the real utility of the Abraham Accords. That's the spirit of the Abraham Accords. It acquired more than that with the adding of essentially sort of over the horizon, the Indians and so forth. But that then gets to the core point, which is the real breakthrough for peace in the region is going to come when the Iranian regime falls. Because with all due respect for the Saudis, the big prize is Iran. Because with Iran, you also get the Indians. It's a very common culture, common civilization. And if you start getting the Indians, the Iranians, the Israelis on one side, then nothing's going to stop them. That is a very powerful strategic bloc that anchors Western interests. But obviously, you can't get to the day after in Iran until you get a day after of the Ayatollahs. So really, that boils down to that key point: what has to be done, and done quickly, to bring down this regime. That, to me, is going to be the only solution to endless wars. Everything else will lead to endless wars and weakness. So to me, that's the next step of the Abraham Accords, is the Cyrus Accords.
Can I just make one quick point on this, too? Part of my skepticism about what was going to come of all of this is rooted in the fact that the Abraham Accords is a bit of a flim-flam, because it's rooted in the idea that there are three great Abrahamic faiths, and they all worship the same God. And they're basically just sort of different flavors of one religious concept. And I would respectfully say, as I have all evening, that's rubbish.
We have so many more questions, but virtually no time. But before we do adjourn, just really quickly, your last thoughts. Positive, are you optimistic, pessimistic? What do you think is going to happen? This is the rapid fire round.
Yeah, I'm going to leave this on a very positive note. We've got a situation in the Levant. I mean, one, I think we're close with Iran. And as I said, I think that's a dramatic game changer. I mean, it's game, set, match. But add to it one more thing, which is all of a sudden you've got Druze, Christians, Alawites, and I would argue after Iran, Shiites, all see Israel as their protector from Turkey. And the Kurds. So all of a sudden you see the entirety of the eastern littoral of the Mediterranean becoming a strategic bloc. And I know that that's what they're thinking there. I know that's what the Druze are thinking. I know that's what the Maronites and the Greek Orthodox are a little bit up in the air still, but definitely the Maronites are there. I know the Alawites are thinking about it, shockingly, after being Ba'athist, and I know the Shiites are thinking about it. That's a game changer. You had Iran and that, and all of a sudden, Turkey is overplaying its hand.
Wow.
I'll take the pessimistic round and the optimistic round too. You know, for a lot of Americans seeing October 7th, we had to wonder, could this happen here? And let me just give you a little bit of background on October 7th in about 5 seconds. The Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza operates as Hamas. Originally, they were supposedly a religious organization. They operated out of mosques. They ran charities. There are 2 other Muslim Brotherhood groups that operate in Israel, the Islamic movement, the Northern Islamic movement, the Southern Islamic movement. They actually run for office. They have members of Israel's parliament, the Knesset. So the so-called moderate non-Muslim Brotherhood we have here, the political non-Muslim Brotherhood that we have here, could at a given time turn into the Hamas right in the United States just the way that they did in Israel. And they can actually have a combination of the two. You can have terrorists operating on the one hand. By the way, Al-Qaeda was originally came out of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was a splinter group of the Muslim Brotherhood. Most of Al-Qaeda's leaders have been Muslim Brotherhood members originally back in the day. So that we can have this parallelism. We can have the mosques that pretend to be political Islam or just purely political, and you can have the jihadis, and you can have them both at the same time. Now, the optimistic and the pessimistic part of that is simple. No, we're still waiting for the United States to really wake up and recognize the kind of war we're in. The Israelis had a forced wake-up call after October 7th. I don't know how bad things have to get in the United States for us to wake up, but even if we do actually have things get bad, the good news out of that is that we will wake up. If the actual worst happens, we will actually have the wake-up call that the Israelis did. We have a chance to actually recognize the threats that we face and to act against them.
Wow. Yeah, great.
Well,
I like the kind of reluctant applause from some people. Oh, God.
We're very enthusiastic.
they were applauding for the optimistic part, I think. Look, I'm just approaching it as realistically as I can with common sense. And I think that whether it turns out well or it doesn't turn out well depends in part on us. If we are doing our job of arousing our countrymen and women to the sorts of things we've been talking about tonight, if we're making it clear that the current situation in which really terrible things haven't happened yet is not predictive of really terrible things not ever happening, when there are so many reasons, and you've just heard some of them, that they will, then we have a chance to do what we started out talking about, what we've talked about repeatedly through the course of the evening, which is to awaken the American people. And this is what I love about what Karen does with the American Freedom Alliance, whether it's on the road or whether it's here or whether it's, on her virtual platforms and so on, is awakening the American people. So I'm going to close by just saying very boldly, please support the work she does here. It's vital. We need it more than ever. And with your help, it will come out right. Thank you.
I second that.
Me too.
And also
Thank
Daniel's great outfit.
And yes, well, thank you for that. And please, thanks to the 3 of you. It was just completely Frank, Daniel, David,